Hi there everyone, and welcome to the Good News According to Job. I trust you're all doing well and that you're excited for this next week of Job as we turn to Zophar, the third of the three friends that are about to speak. And as Zophar speaks, it starts to draw us to a conclusion of the first cycle. And once this is done, we will move into the next cycle as we have Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar repeating another cycle. And then to notice that in the third cycle we have Eliphaz and Bildad, but Zophar doesn't speak. So that's interesting, something to keep in the back of our minds as we read what Zophar does say here, and to pick up the type of language that he uses and how he speaks to Job and into the circumstance that Job is facing. Zophar is also unique to us because of the way in which he considers things. We've had Eliphaz and Bildad who think about things from a slightly different angle. They are either experiential thinkers, they think about stuff from an experiential perspective or a traditional perspective, how things have been handed down and how they perceive life from what they have learned growing up. Zophar, however, presents us with a slightly different approach to looking at life, looking at the world around us, looking at God. Zophar presents us with the idea of wisdom. And he is the first out of the three friends to actually really introduce the idea of wisdom, not only wisdom of man, but actually the wisdom of God. And so this is incredibly unique because not only does Zophar really introduce wisdom, but we will begin to hear the language of wisdom flowing out from the other friends after this. So Zophar seems to be, on one level, an introducer, someone that comes along to introduce the concept of wisdom far more tangibly and far more clearly than what the other two have done up until this point. It's not to say that the others weren't speaking out of a place of wisdom, but this is the type of portfolio that we can give to Zophar. Zophar, in that regard, is the philosopher of the group. He is the one that considers, he weighs things up, and he brings wisdom. So his approach, his observation, his contemplation of things is from a place of wisdom, from a place of philosophy, from a place of wrestling with position, our position before God. And this is really unique, very interesting as we consider it. And we might find ourselves to a massive degree wanting to agree with him. And there's a lot that Zophar is about to say here that is very agreeable. That there is a lot that we look at and we can see how that is true. But again, as I've said with the other discourses of the friends, Eliphaz and Bildad, we need to ask the vital question: is what is being said applicable to Job? Because if we don't ask that question, we might be taken off and find ourselves agreeing with what the friends have to say, rather than agreeing with what the author and what God has said about Job. So really consider again, what have we been told in the beginning of Job about Job? We've been told by the author and by God that Job is blameless, he is upright, he fears God, and he shuns evil. Now these are important things to hold on to as we work through these discourses. If we lose sight of them, we are going to get caught up in what the friends have to say. And a lot of what they say may be agreeable and may make sense to us. But does it make sense in light of Job? In light of the book of Job, in light of what we are being told about Job, that he is blameless. And so as we turn to Zophar this week, we will see that that very idea is challenged. The blamelessness of Job even gets challenged this week, a little bit more directly by Zophar. So as we begin, I'm not going to read through the whole of this passage, but as we go, we're going to pick up the verses and consider them, and most likely by the end we would have covered the bulk of what Job 11 has to say here. But let's begin by just considering the second and third verse of Job 11. It says this: "Are all these words to go unanswered? Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock?" And so it starts off with Zophar asking these rhetorical questions pertaining to Job and the fact that nobody has yet outright rebuked Job. Nobody has said to Job, keep quiet, what you're saying is wrong. And what is frightening about what Zophar has to say here is, as he says in verse 2, are all these words to go unanswered? Is all this talk to be vindicated? He is actually saying to us here, or saying to Job, is nobody going to answer what you have to ask? Is nobody going to challenge you? Is nobody going to tell you that what you are saying is wrong, and instead, by doing so, put you in the right? Are you going to be vindicated by not being corrected? And then he says in verse 3 again, will your idle talk reduce others to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock? So he goes even further. He says that your talk at this point is actually just reducing people to silence. They aren't responding to you, and nobody is actually rebuking you. People need to rebuke you for what you're saying. And then he goes further, and he sums up what Job is saying as a form of mockery toward the friends, toward others. So what Zophar is saying here is that what Job says is a mockery. What Job is saying and the things that he is questioning is a mockery to who they are. So these are strong words that Zophar begins with. And we need to consider, so just pause there for a moment and think about it. Has what Job said been out of a space of mocking anyone? And I feel that if we do wrestle with that long and hard enough, we can see clearly that there is nothing that Job has said that comes across as a mockery. It is heartfelt. It is searching the depths of his despair. But nowhere does it come across as mockery. Nowhere does it come across as something that is used to pull others down, to diminish other people in what he has to say. Beyond that, Job has not said anything that has been directly intentional to silence people. Job has asked questions, but it has simply been that nobody has been willing to answer him in a way that is applicable to his circumstance. So at this point, what Zophar is asking is questions, rhetorical questions, but questions pertaining to someone needing to rebuke Job, because otherwise he's going to continue to speak and say things that in their perspective is a mockery of what he is saying, of what they believe. And so we have the next verse there, verse 4, that we need to highlight. You say to God, my beliefs are flawless and I am pure in your sight. Now, this might seem to be a shocking thing if someone had to say that. If any of us today had to say that, it may seem like a mockery. It may seem that if we had to say that my beliefs are flawless and I'm pure in sight, that what I'm saying is a mockery. It may be a mockery of who we believe in. It may be a mockery of the people around us. It may be a mockery in so many levels, because the reality is that that's not true. And nobody can claim that to be true, because we fail, and we have failed so many times in this world. However, what we are told with regards to Job is that he is blameless. Now, it's not to say that Job is without sin and that his beliefs are perfect, but the way in which he believes and the way in which he is pure is a reflection of what God has already told us, that he fears God and that he shuns evil. So these are two important things to pick up, that his fear of God and his shunning of evil is two aspects of his belief, and which is flawless, and his pure sight, that the way he conducts himself, his blamelessness, his uprightness, but also his fearing of God, his focus on God is pure. His focus on his direction of life, his heart's desire is on God. And so if we are reminded of what the author and what God has told us, that Job is blameless and that he is upright and that he does fear God and he does shun evil, then what is said here by Zophar doesn't ring true. Because Job is not saying, for one, he hasn't said that his beliefs are flawless, but he has said that he is blameless. And beyond that, that he hasn't used the language that he is pure in sight, but that he is upright. And these are things that we pick up in the language of what Job has said, but nowhere does Job outright use this sort of language. But needless to say, he is blameless and he is upright. So however you want to work with those two concepts of what Zophar says here against what God has said, we do know that God has set him apart as being slightly different to the rest, slightly different to us, or actually significantly different to us, because Job has a stage or a point in his life where he can claim that, where he can say that he is blameless, that he is upright, because of the way he conducts himself, the way he carries himself, the way he strives to serve God, to love him, to fear him, but to be dedicated to God. The next two verses that we need to look at there is what Zophar carries on to say in verse 5 and 6. Let's read. Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you, and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. For true wisdom has two sides. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. So this is a very interesting thing that Zophar says here, and we need to highlight this as we consider Zophar, the one who speaks out of a contemplation of wisdom, out of a contemplation of a philosophical contemplation. And so what Zophar says in verse 5 is quite unique. He says, oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you. So it is now Zophar who is inciting God to speak, saying, God, if you would rather just speak against Job, silence him, get him to keep quiet, because what he is saying is a mockery. And so this is quite interesting, that Zophar, rather than trying to convince Job, to some degree seems to be pleading to God that God would rather deal with Job, that God would rather speak to Job. And so on the surface, this looks like quite a good thing to say, that it is up to God to deal with Job, as well as the other way around, that it's up to God to deal with the friends. But the question at the end of the day is what has just been said by Zophar before this in verses 2, 3, and 4 actually true? So why would God need to be incited against Job if what Job has said up until this point is not wrong? That nothing that he has said is against God. Nothing that he has said is false. But then Zophar carries on in verse 6 where he says, I disclose to you the secrets of wisdom. So now Zophar is saying not only must God speak and correct Job, but actually show Job wisdom. So this is quite beautiful, that Zophar would actually say that Job needs to get a bit of wisdom. Not only get wisdom, but see God's wisdom. And then he says this, he says, for true wisdom has two sides. And this is quite interesting because it's unique, it's true. Wisdom is not just black and white. It's not so straightforward. There is sides to it. It's complicated. And so when we consider wisdom, there is a multifaceted aspect of wisdom. But the strange thing of what Zophar says here is in the second half of this verse. He says, know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. So there is the way in which this is phrased is a little ambiguous. It's a little bit strange by what Zophar is saying here. He has just said that wisdom has two sides. But what he says here is a dangerous statement. So the question is, has he said this intentionally? to prove and demonstrate the two-sidedness to wisdom as a sort of a picture of what wisdom looks like? Or is he saying this intentionally and implying one thing but actually saying another thing that he doesn't actually realize? So what he is saying, on one level, he says, God has even forgotten some of your sin. It could suggest that on one side, God has decided to forget some of your sin. You have sinned, and God has already turned his sight on it. He has forgotten it. And so he has been gracious to you. Or it could, on the other side, be saying that you have sinned so much so that God has even begun to forget how much you have sinned. Now that's a dangerous statement, because God doesn't forget. God isn't simply a God that forgets. He shows grace, but it doesn't mean that he forgets when he shows grace. It's there. He's aware of it, but he also knows what we have done. And so for someone like Zophar to say to Job at this point that you have sinned so much that God has begun to forget all your sins is supposed to be a jab, an insult toward Job and his immense amount of sin. But at the same time, it comes across that God is a forgetful God. And so we see this two sides to what Zophar is saying here. And we need to ask, what is Zophar saying here? Is this true? Is it possible that Zophar is using an illustration here to prove that wisdom can have two sides? Or is he saying this out of ignorance to the other side of what he is saying? It's a peculiar thing that we don't have the answer for. But it is interesting that we can just see it and notice it, that this is how peculiar wisdom can be. That wisdom is not something that you can quantify too quickly or too easily, and especially so when it comes to God's wisdom. God's wisdom doesn't always make sense to us. Most of the time, for that matter, it doesn't make sense to us. Because if we were left to do it, we would want to do it differently. And that's an indication that God's wisdom doesn't make sense to us. But as we continue, we'll see how Zophar considers this a little deeper. He says there in verse 7, "Can you fathom the mysteries of God? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty?" Now this is interesting, because at this point Zophar begins to expand this idea of looking at God, considering the wisdom of God, the measurement of God, which is impossible. That it is impossible for anybody to come along and try and measure the extent of God's incredible wisdom. And so he says there, can you fathom? It sounds similar to that, what we will hear later on, is that idea of who can know the mind of God. So who can know God's wisdom? Who can know the mind of God? And so where Zophar seems to be correct in this is that this is true. We can't begin to comprehend God's wisdom. We can't begin to comprehend the extent of it, or measure it, or be able to size it up. But as Zophar wrestles through this and he challenges Job, he is challenging Job by saying, well, who are you to be able to measure God, to be able to measure his understanding, his wisdom, the way he thinks and does things? And so this begins to be the backdrop of what Zophar is trying to challenge Job on. But unfortunately, entering into this territory to say on one side that who can know the mysteries of God, who can measure God's wisdom, you enter into territory that can be quite dangerous, because you can begin to trip over your own words. You begin to trip over things that you have previously said, saying something like, who can know the mysteries of God? You need to then be careful what you are going to say and what follows. Because as Zophar continues to talk to Job, he begins to speak from a place as if he knows Job's position before God. And so Zophar, from what he has said, begins to enter into dangerous territory, assuming that he knows that Job is not blameless. Yet we are told by God that Job is blameless. So how is it that Zophar is able to know that Job isn't blameless? Has he somehow managed to plumb the depths of God's incredible wisdom? Can you probe the limits of the Almighty? And perhaps that's where Zophar has started stumbling over his own words as he carries on. So listen to this in verse 10. If he comes along and confines you in prison and convenes a court, who can oppose him? So here we hear Zophar picking up on the similar kind of language that Job has been using. And then he carries on. Surely he recognizes deceivers when he sees evil. Does he not take note? But the witless can no more become wise than a wild donkey's colt can be born human. And so the danger of what Zophar is doing is he's entering into a territory where he's accusing Job on some levels of being a deceiver and being witless. And so what we are told, though, up front, is that those are the opposite types of descriptions to what Job is. Job shows wisdom because he fears the Lord. The beginning of wisdom is fearing the Lord. And we see that Job fears the Lord, and because of that we recognize that he has wisdom and he is not witless. And beyond that, we know that he is not a deceiver, because when God looks at him, he sees that he is blameless and upright. A person that is upright does not deceive. And so Zophar is accusing Job of being something that he is not, something that goes against the incredible mystery of who God is and God's wisdom and what God has said already about Job. Let's turn to verse 13 to 15. It says, Yet if you devote your heart to him and stretch out your hands to him, if you put away the sin that is in your hand and allow no evil to dwell in your tent, then free of fault you will lift up your face. You will stand firm without fear. And so this is interesting at this point, what Zophar is saying. He's saying, Job, give up your sin. Stop sinning, and your life will turn around. Stop sinning, and you won't have to fear God. And this seems like quite an arrogant thing to actually say, because we know that the fear that Job has for God is not out of a fear because Job has necessarily sinned, but actually a fear of God because God is central and primary in his life. God is the focal point of his life. And so Zophar comes along and says, stop sinning, and you will live a far more peaceful life. If you stop sinning, you won't feel afflicted. You won't experience this incredible hardship that you are experiencing. But the challenge with this is, how can Zophar know this? How can Zophar know that if Job had to stop sinning, even though we know that Job hasn't sinned in anything that he has done or said, that if Job had to stop, how could Zophar know that things would change, that Job's circumstance would change, that Job's outlook on life and heart and emotions and all of those things would change? How can he speak with such certainty? Who has given him the depth of understanding to know that? And so this is where we see Zophar beginning to trip over his own words. And we see the double-edgedness or the double side to wisdom. That yes, what Zophar has said may have been true in saying that God is wise and that there is a double side to wisdom. But it is in that double-sidedness of wisdom that Zophar is tripping. And he finds himself stumbling as he responds to Job here. The last section of Job, of this Job 11, is verse 16 onwards. And what we can do there is we can quickly read through it. And it says, You will surely forget your trouble, recalling it only as waters gone by. Life will be brighter than noonday, and darkness will become like morning. You will be secure because there is hope. You will look about you and take your rest in safety. You will lie down with no one to make you afraid, and many will court your favor. And so this is the picture that Zophar has really painted here, of this idea that if you surrender, if you admit to your sins, that life will begin to turn around and you'll have safety, you'll have rest, you'll have security, and people will flock to you for that. And then the final thing he says is in verse 20, but the eyes of the wicked will fail, and escape will elude them. Their hope will become a dying gasp. And so there's this slight edge to what Zophar is saying, that this final line that he says, their hope will become a dying gasp, could be suggesting that this is the state that Job is currently in, that this final hope, or this hope that he has, is their dying gasp. And he is picking up on what Job has said then in the past, that Job says he would have preferred to have gone from womb to grave. And here he is saying that language, that hope for the grave is your dying grasp. That is an indication that you are unwilling to turn from your sin and to rest in who God is. But yet this isn't true, because what Zophar has actually told us here, what he's actually showed us, is not so much that Job is unrepentant, but that wisdom is complicated. Wisdom isn't as straightforward as we can simply begin to imagine. That when God thinks and does things and acts, his wisdom is so far greater than what we can even begin to imagine. And so this is something that we can consider today even further. Where do we stumble over our thinking of who God is and the wisdom that he presents to us? When we look at the world around us, we see things in a certain way. We see things either through a belief system, a tradition, a philosophical perspective. But the reality is those things fall apart when we think that they fit, or that God fits within those frameworks of thinking. And so we need to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of Zophar as making these statements the prerequisite of how to view and wrestle and deal with life. Because life isn't that black and white. Life isn't that straightforward. There is complications when we deal with a God that is infinitely greater than us. It becomes complicated because when we consider who God is and weigh up who God is in his infinite wisdom, we shy away in light of that. We can't begin to measure up the extent of his wisdom. So when you look around the world today and what's happening with all the hardship, with all the suffering, with all the spreading of virus, but not just the coronavirus, but with the effects of even sin and death in this world, it is only through God's immense wisdom that he could come and deal with those problems. If it was left up to us, and to some degree we don't need to look far to see that, but when it is left up to man to deal with life and its challenges and its circumstances, we begin to grasp at straws. And we're not sure how to always handle it because we don't understand the full extent of it, the complexities of this world that we live in. But it's only God, the creator of this world, that can fully understand and comprehend it. He is the one that has shaped it in his wisdom, in his understanding. And so when we look out at the world and we see it in absolute chaos, wherever man tries to fix it and solve it, it's never permanent. It's never something that will last. Even if it lasts for 100 years, there will come a point where things will fall apart, where man has constructed a system or a way of thinking around it. It is only God in his infinite wisdom that can solidify something, that can change something, that can transform something. And that we see so much so as we turn to his Son, Jesus Christ. And as we've said in previous sessions, that it is through God's incredible wisdom that he gave us his Son, Jesus Christ. And we will see that all the more growing in immense detail and clarity as we see God's wisdom wrapped up in his Son, Jesus Christ. That we are in the wrong. We aren't like Job. We have blame, we have sinned, we have fallen short. But it's even in that in God's wisdom, He has given us His Son to set us free, to save us from that. But when we look at our world and how we rule it and govern it and do things in it, it's corrupt, it falls apart, it's never perfect. But what God does, when He acts, and when God acts out of His wisdom, it is perfect, it is precise, it is life-changing, it is life-giving. And so I hope that you can wrestle with this. Wrestle with what Zophar has to say. Consider how he has put it. Consider where you've stumbled over your own wisdom or your own words, however you want to put it. How you've maybe fallen short, thinking that you can grasp and understand God's wisdom, and thinking that you have it, thinking that you have grasped it, you actually begin to trip and fall over it. And so this is an interesting thing, what Zophar does in these discourses as we wrestle with Job, wrestle with the friends, wrestle with what Zophar says. It challenges something in us to really consider, where do we speak from? Where do we look when we talk? And how do we wrestle with life and circumstances? And when we turn to God, do we think that simply looking to God is enough? Or do we need to rest in God rather than go to God and try and grasp an answer to take it to someone, but rather point people to God, to Christ, and say that that is the answer, and only He can fully answer whatever challenges, whatever questions we may face. So I hope that encourages you, challenges you, gets you to think. If you have a question, if you have a struggle, if you have something that's burning in your heart to ask and wrestle with, I challenge you to take it to God. He is all wise. He is the one with the answer. Go to Him. And may you be encouraged and rest and find true rest in our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the embodiment, the entire perfect picture of God's wisdom for us today. Have a great week. Cheers.